In 1945, the world was exhausted. World War II had ended, but peace did not feel like victory. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Survivors were traumatized. Out of this destruction, two nations emerged stronger than all others. The United States and the Soviet Union. At first, they were allies. They had fought the same enemy. But once the war ended, their unity collapsed almost immediately. Why? Because these two nations believed in completely opposite ideas. The United States stood for democracy, capitalism, and individual freedom. The Soviet Union stood for communism, state control, and absolute authority. Each side believed its system was the future of humanity, and each side believed the other was dangerous. This rivalry became known as the Cold War. It was called a Cold War because the superpowers never fought each other directly. But make no mistake, this was one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Instead of armies, the Cold War was fought with fear. Instead of battlefields, it was fought through spies, propaganda, political pressure, and nuclear weapons. The world was now divided into two camps. Countries were forced to choose sides. Neutrality was almost impossible, and nowhere was this division more visible than in Germany. After World War II, Germany was punished for its role in the conflict. The country was split into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Soon, these zones merged into 2 nations: West Germany, backed by the US and its allies; East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union. Even the capital city, Berlin, was divided, despite being deep inside East German territory. West Berlin became an island of freedom surrounded by communism, and people noticed the difference. In West Berlin, businesses grew. People spoke freely. Opportunities existed. In East Germany, life was controlled. The government watched its citizens closely. Travel was restricted. Criticism was dangerous. As time passed, East Germans began to escape. They crossed into West Berlin seeking freedom and a better life. By the late 1950s, millions had fled. For the Soviet Union and the East German government, this was humiliating. Every escape proved something terrifying. People preferred freedom over control. The communist system was bleeding citizens, and if this continued, East Germany would collapse. The Soviet leadership needed a solution. Not tomorrow, not next year, immediately. And that solution would soon rise from the streets of Berlin, a structure that would become the most powerful symbol of division the world had ever seen. On the night of August 13, 1961, Berlin went to sleep as a divided city. But no one expected what would happen next. In the early hours of the morning, while most families were asleep, East German soldiers and police quietly moved into position. They carried rolls of barbed wire, concrete posts, weapons. Within hours, streets were blocked. Railway lines were cut. Neighborhoods were sealed. People woke up to find their city split overnight. What shocked the world was not just the speed, but the cruelty. A husband could no longer reach his wife. A mother could not cross the street to see her children. Friends waved at each other from windows, knowing they might never meet again. This was not a border. This was a prison wall. The East German government claimed the wall was built to protect its citizens from Western aggression. But everyone knew the truth. The wall was built to stop people from leaving. Before the wall, escaping was relatively simple. Berlin had been an open doorway to freedom. After the wall, escape meant risking death. Barbed wire soon turned into concrete. Watchtowers rose. Guards were ordered to shoot anyone attempting to cross. The Berlin Wall was no longer temporary. It was permanent, and it was deadly. On the western side, life continued. People could travel, speak freely, build businesses, criticize their leaders. On the eastern side, fear ruled everyday life. The government watched its citizens closely. Neighbors reported neighbors. Children were taught loyalty to the state above family. The wall didn't just divide streets, it divided minds. East Germans lived under constant surveillance by the Stasi, one of the most ruthless intelligence agencies in history. Letters were opened. Phones were tapped. Private conversations were no longer private. Freedom became a memory. Despite the danger, people still tried to escape. Some dug tunnels beneath the wall. Some hid in vehicles. Some attempted to climb over. Many never made it. Over the years, more than 140 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Some were shot by guards. Some drowned in the Spree River. Some were captured and disappeared into prisons. One of the most heartbreaking stories involved a young man named Peter Fechter. In 1962, Fechter attempted to climb the wall near Checkpoint Charlie. He was shot, and then left to bleed to death in public view, while crowds on both sides watched helplessly. His death became a global symbol of the wall's cruelty. The world could no longer ignore Berlin. Western leaders condemned the wall. Protests erupted. Tensions exploded. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin. Standing near the wall, he delivered words that echoed across the globe. Ich bin ein Berliner. It was more than a sentence. It was a promise that freedom had not been forgotten. But behind the speeches and symbols, something darker was growing. Because Berlin was no longer just a city, it was the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth. Two nuclear-armed superpowers now faced each other, separated by concrete guns and fear. One mistake, one misunderstanding, and the Cold War could turn hot. The Berlin Wall soon became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War. On one side, democracy, capitalism, and free speech. On the other, control, censorship, and fear. Families learned to live with separation. Children grew up without knowing relatives just meters away. The wall stood not just as concrete, but as proof that ideology could imprison millions. Yet history had not finished its story. Because while the wall looked strong, the system behind it was already starting to crack. The world on the edge of nuclear war. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had reached a terrifying stage. Both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities in seconds. Each side knew that if war ever began, there would be no winners. This balance of fear was called mutually assured destruction. The idea was simple and horrifying. If one side launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond. And the result would be the end of civilization. For years, this fear kept both sides in check. But in 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. In October 1962, American spy planes made a shocking discovery. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. These missiles could reach major U.S. cities in minutes. When President John F. Kennedy was informed, the situation became an emergency. If the United States attacked Cuba, the Soviet Union could retaliate in Europe and especially in Berlin. If the U.S. did nothing, it would appear weak. For 13 days, the world held its breath. American warships surrounded Cuba. Nuclear bombers were placed on alert. Missile silos stood ready. Children practiced hiding under desks in schools. Families prepared emergency shelters. People genuinely believed the end of the world was near. Behind closed doors, leaders debated decisions that could kill millions. One wrong move, one misinterpreted signal, and humanity would disappear. In the end, diplomacy narrowly saved the world. The Soviet Union agreed to remove missiles from Cuba. The United States secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. War was avoided, but the lesson was clear. The Cold War was not just politics. It was a constant countdown to destruction. While the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, Berlin remained the most sensitive flashpoint on Earth. American and Soviet tanks once faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie, separated by only a few meters. Guns were loaded. Engines were running. One shot could have triggered World War III. For 16 hours, the world watched. Then slowly, the tanks pulled back. Once again, disaster was avoided, barely. Berlin proved something terrifying. Peace depended not on trust, but on restraint. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the Cold War continued. The Berlin Wall still stood. Families remained divided. East Germans lived under surveillance. At the same time, both superpowers raced to build more powerful weapons. Thousands of nuclear warheads were created, enough to destroy the world many times over. People lived normal lives, went to work, raised children, while knowing that everything could end in minutes. This psychological pressure shaped an entire generation. Fear became normal. But no system based on fear lasts forever. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, cracks began to appear in the communist world. The Soviet economy was failing. Resources were wasted on weapons instead of people. Citizens grew tired of censorship and control. In Eastern Europe, whispers of change spread quietly. Protests began. Artists spoke out. Young people questioned the system. The wall still stood strong, but belief in it was fading. And without belief, even concrete cannot survive. The fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War. By the late 1980s, the world was changing. The Cold War had lasted more than 4 decades, but the system holding it together was collapsing from within. The Soviet Union was in serious trouble. Its economy was failing. Stores were empty. Technology lagged behind the West. People were tired. Tired of fear. Tired of control. Tired of lies. In 1985, a new Soviet leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev understood one critical truth. The Soviet system could not survive as it was. He introduced 2 major reforms: glasnost, openness and freedom of information; perestroika, economic restructuring. For the first time, people were allowed to speak more freely. Criticism was no longer immediately punished. Change felt possible, but once fear disappears, control becomes impossible. In East Germany, the effects were immediate. People watched reforms happening in the Soviet Union and asked a dangerous question: why not us? Peaceful protests began in cities like Leipzig. At first they were small, then they grew. Week after week, tens of thousands marched, not with weapons, but with candles. Their message was simple: we want freedom. The East German government faced a choice: violence or change. Unlike China's Tiananmen Square, East Germany hesitated. They did not fire, and that hesitation changed history. On the evening of November 9, 1989, an East German official named Günter Schabowski held a routine press conference. He was supposed to announce new travel regulations, but he was confused. When a journalist asked when the new rules would take effect, Schabowski hesitated, then answered, "Immediately." Those single words spread like wildfire. Radio stations reported that the borders were open. Thousands rushed to the Berlin Wall. Guards were unprepared. They had no clear orders. Crowds demanded to cross. And then something unthinkable happened. The guards opened the gates. People flooded through. Strangers hugged. Families reunited. Tears flowed freely. Some climbed onto the wall. Others began breaking it apart with hammers and bare hands. There were no bombs, no battles, no gunfire. The Berlin Wall, the most powerful symbol of division in human history, fell peacefully. The world watched in disbelief. Within months, East Germany collapsed. Communist governments across Eastern Europe fell, and in 1991 the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War was over, not with a war, but with people. The Cold War nearly destroyed humanity, not because of hatred, but because of fear. Fear created walls. Fear justified weapons. Fear silenced millions. The Berlin Wall proved something powerful. No system built on fear can last forever. Truth eventually breaks through concrete. Courage outlives control. And people, when united, can change history without violence. The Cold War is not just a chapter in a textbook. It is a warning. Technology has advanced. Weapons are stronger. But human nature remains the same. The question history asks us is simple. Will we build new walls? Or will we remember how the last one fell? Because history doesn't just belong to the past. It belongs to those who learn from it.